Surprise. Thrilled to be joined by Berwood Yost, the director of the for Opinion Research at Franklin Marshall College. He's also runs the Franklin Marshall College poll that was released on Thursday. Berwood, thanks again for joining us.
Hey, good to see you, Steve. Thanks for having me again.
A lot to chew on as you unveiled the most recent poll. I know one of the things that jumped out at me when I perused everything was the fact that last October, getting ready for the presidential election, 30% of Pennsylvanians said the economy, personal finances were the most important factor as they got ready to cast their vote. This time around, 12 months later, it's only 12% that is concerned most about the economy. They're more concerned about what appears to be the dysfunction, not only in Harrisburg, but in Washington as well.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think there's no doubt that the post-election analyses showed that, um, you know, it was the economy that drove voters' choices last fall. And even though, the sentiment about people's personal finances has not changed much since then. The thing that they tell us is most important has to do with government politics, not the economy. And I think that's probably related to the dysfunction they're seeing at both the state and national level. Um, I guess I call it dysfunction. Maybe other people would call it a stand based on principles. But however you look at it, at the state and at the federal level, we don't have budgets, and so whenever particularly at the state level, when we ask about state problems and we don't have a state budget, normally concerns about politics and politicians and government rise to the top. Um, Last time we really saw that was during the Wolf administration when we had that protracted, was it 8 or 9 month budget stalemate? We saw the concerns about government politics rise. And I think that's really what we're seeing now. It's not that people don't have concerns about the economy, but I think front and center is their concern that their governments aren't working the way they want them to.
I know when you look at that, you say, well, the state budget's been now 102 days at the time of our recording that we don't have something in place. Did you get a sense as you looked at the collection of the data that there's something more to this? Because let's look at Donald Trump's favorability. Let's look at Josh Shapiro's favorability and what they think of the job performance. When you look at the state budget, is this something that maybe Senate Republicans are just trying to hamstring, let's say, Governor Shapiro getting ready for a 2026 reelection run?
Look, I would not try to guess at the motivations for partisans on either side. They have their own ideas about what they're trying to accomplish, and I'm not really sure what those are. Um, but if, as you say, that's their purpose, it hasn't harmed the governor's job approval rating. His numbers are still positive. He's still a very popular governor, as I've explained to a few people. Um, his numbers are almost a throwback in some ways to earlier days when there used to be cross-party appeal. There's still something like a quarter of Republicans who rate the governor's job performance as positive. So, I think whatever the motivations, this budget stalemate has not hurt him yet. Um, and so, you know, we'll see how that changes. But at the moment, I don't see this as being a problem for him. Nationally, actually, it you could probably say the same for President Trump's approval ratings. Yes, his approval ratings, Steve, are a bit lower than Governor Shapiro's, and that's no surprise. We know from other polls, and when you look at governors in other states, Shapiro's a pretty popular incumbent. But there is some nuance here with Trump's approval ratings. First, his numbers are about where they were at the end of his first term. So his numbers have stabilized. You can see his base has sort of rallied around him. Um, the other thing that's really fascinating is when we ask about specific things that his administration is doing, he gets a lot more credit for things beyond jobs and jobs creations this time than he did last time in his first administration. So he's getting basically positive remarks or responses for handling immigration. I think 48% of voters give him an A or B for that. Um, Foreign policy, I think it's something like 42% give him an A or B for his handling of foreign policy. In his first term, those numbers were in the mid 30s. Now, the problem I think that he confronts, if and when, to get back to your first question, people start really focusing on the economy again, is that his numbers for job creation are in the mid 30s, whereas in his first term, they were in the mid 40s. And he's also pretty well underwater in terms of handling inflation. And I suspect that those two issues are going to become more front and center as the midterms certainly get closer.
This is certainly one of those times we've talked with you before that we would remind viewers to go to the Politics PA website, go to our story, and don't just look at the top line numbers, dig deeper to see what more you can uncover there. Because if you look at just 24% say Trump is doing an excellent job, 17% is a good job, you combine those two numbers, and like you said, 41% is where he was at the end of the first term. But there are some underlying things that viewers would be wise to go view.
Yeah, and not only that, contextually, his numbers are about where Barack Obama's numbers were in the state at the same point in his second term, and they're better than George Bush's were. So you know, eh, the number alone is interesting, but the context around it is important. And so, yeah, I would encourage people to dig in deep to see all those connections.
Talking about the governor, as you mentioned, his numbers right now, 51%, either excellent or good job performance. Very high, especially for a governor in his third year as he begins to turn the corner. When you look at this kind of number and you look at some of the past governors that we've had for the Commonwealth, are we just finding perhaps the support the Republicans have and the support the Democrats have for him that we maybe have settled on a moderate that the Commonwealth voters can all agree upon?
Perhaps. I mean, like I said, there's cross-party appeal here. That's unusual in this day and age. I suspect that comes from the brand that the Shapiro administration and the governor himself has tried to put forward. So, yeah, I mean, he's been largely successful in that. I'll tell you, Steve, the trajectory of gubernatorial approval ratings in the state are interesting in the first term because normally they start high, they sort of fade a bit, and then once the reelection campaign kicks in, normally those numbers improve because sitting governors are reminding voters about what they've done, and it reinforces sort of the things they want to say about themselves. Shapiro's trajectory has been actually a little different than that, in that his numbers were pretty good, and then they went up, as opposed to kind of receding for most governors, and he's remained high. And so the question is, when his reelection campaign kicks off, does he continue to build on those numbers, or is his opponent able to eat away some of that support? I think that's going to be imperative if you're the Republican candidate running for governor. You're going to have to find a way to ding those job approval ratings because that 51%, typically governors, first-term governors with that approval level get reelected.
The premier election in the 2025 cycle is certainly the retention vote for Pennsylvania Supreme Court. When you look at the top line numbers, you see that none of the three exceeded 31% of respondents that said, yes, we want to retain them. But I get the sense that at this time, given the fact that many voters still aren't in tune with what they're going to be voting on come November 4th, that number is actually pretty high, isn't it?
Boy, this one's I've talked a lot about context in some of our previous questions. The context for this one is um, this race is really out of the traditional context we have for Supreme Court elections. They normally fly under the radar. As you well know, there's no partisan affiliation on the ballot for these people. It's a simple yes or no question. Do you want to retain state Supreme Court justice, whatever the name is? Yes or no. And normally turnout is 30 some percent of registered voters. Not a lot of people are paying attention. Maybe the Bar Association says they're worthy of retention or not. That's kind of what the considerations that voters have. Nobody shows up. This race is nothing like that. I'm sure you've had any fair share of mailers and text messages and phone calls telling you to vote yes or to vote no. So this race is definitely not flying below the radar. Even our assessments of turnout suggest it's going to be higher than a normal retention race. As you know, I think I saw a statistic somewhere, Steve, that in the last 27 statewide judicial races, retention races, normally those judges are retained by about 22 percentage points. So they don't, there's only been one time that a judge was not retained, and that was a really unusual circumstance. They usually win by huge amounts, and it's usually not really identified in a partisan way. This time is completely different. When you look at the numbers, you see Republicans are more likely to say they're going to vote no, Democrats more likely to vote yes. And so there's a partisan element to this race we haven't seen previously. I don't think that's a surprise given what's at stake and how important the state Supreme Court is. But that makes this race different. And I think, Steve, when I look at the numbers, yes, I guess let's tell people what the numbers are, right? So as you said, pretty much for every race, if even just looking at likely voters, you've got a third of people who say they don't know. Now, what does don't know mean? Does it mean that they're not paying attention and haven't made up their mind? Or does it mean they're paying attention and they're confused about what they're going to do? I'm not sure which is which. I think it's some of both. So that when you got a third of the electorate who's really not sure what they're doing, that's going to make it really hard to guess where this comes down. The second thing, though, that's important to understand is that each of these justices, the yes is leading the no by about 12 points on average in those three races. So I think that suggests they're probably okay. At the moment, more people favor the retention than not. But again, all bets are off with a third of voters not sure. And if they would say be retained at 10 or 12%, that would be far below the norm in terms of these retention races. So I think it's a complicated question, and I'm not making any predictions or bets on what's going to happen here because I think there's still a lot of advertising and campaigning to go.
I found it kind of fascinating. You mentioned the numbers. Christine Donahue's at 31%, Kevin Doherty at 27%, David Wecht at 25% of the respondents saying yes, they would vote to retain them. You kind of ask yourself why it would go 31, 27, 25 when the three judges, if you put them in a lineup, most of those surveyed couldn't identify them.
So this is an important question, and it's in the full report where you would dig. But one of the things that we were doing in this race, because we assumed there'd be some confusion and maybe people not paying attention, is that we didn't want to just ask people three times who they supported. So we randomized that question. So a third of the sample were asked about Donahue, a third about Doherty, and a third about Wecht. And so I think some of the variability there is just the randomness of the random assignment, right? Because we didn't want to waste space. Survey space is valuable. Time on an instrument's valuable. And we also were worried a little bit about respondent fatigue, asking them the same question three times in a row. And if they didn't know, that can turn voters off and make them not complete the survey. So we asked them about once, and that probably explains some of the variability and the differences. But I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's important to point that out.
That's important for context. Like as we continue to talk about context, let's go back to personal finances. And you put out a number of questions about how Pennsylvanians felt about Donald Trump's signature bill, one big beautiful bill, and it found that it didn't seem like Pennsylvanians were necessarily enamored with the bill itself and what it has wrought at this point. Is that fair?
Yeah, look, the bill's underwater, like 51% oppose versus about 40% favor, according to our estimates. Um, we knew that was the case from national polls at the time that this was passed, that it was not a popular bill. And in fact, some people had said it was one of the most unpopular bills they've ever seen passed. So we wanted to take a read on that. It is generally more unpopular in this state. And I think the reasons are that one, more people think it's going to negatively affect them personally than positively help them. I think second part of that is we asked about people losing their health insurance because of this, and a lot of people said that it's likely that people are going to lose health insurance. A large share of people said that. So people generally, when you just talk about the bill overall, they're not supportive, and when you start talking about the specifics, they're not supportive at all. And so I think, to this point, Republicans have not done a good job selling that bill. And whether they can turn around that bill and perceptions of that bill in time for the midterm elections is probably going to be a crucial question. Um, because it's their bill, they own it, and the way voters think about it will be important come 2026.
Talking about one of Pennsylvania's big economic booms right now seems to be in AI data centers and artificial intelligence. And from looking at the questions and the survey results, it didn't seem as though Pennsylvanians are necessarily on board with the direction that artificial intelligence seems to be headed these days.
Ye- Yeah, look, I mean, first I have to give credit to our students here at F&M because as part of one of our classes, we had students engage in a conversation about what we should ask in the poll. And they came up with a list that was pages long, and we worked with them and narrowed it down. But this is a topic that was at the top of their list because students are talking all the time about the uses of AI. Many of them use it in their schoolwork, and they're trying to figure out how to use it effectively. Um, so, what I thought was interesting about the question first was that not a lot of people are engaging with AI tools every day, right? And when I talked to the students about that, they were like, "Wow, that's a surprise. I thought everybody would be engaged." And so, it's an important reminder that what we may be talking about, not everybody's talking about. But secondly, they're really nervous about the technology. 70 some percent say, "Hey, this concerns me a little bit." And on the flip side, and because of that, most people say we should regulate AI closely at the federal level. So this isn't a partisan response either. I mean, people, Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated, independent, they want to see the federal government regulate AI primarily because they're nervous about what it might do and the consequences of it. So I think this is sort of a call to action for policymakers to really get engaged with this. The sad reality is, though, not many people think the federal government's prepared to do this kind of work, and so they want to see it happen. They're not, it seems to be, confident that the federal government will act as they should.
Let's talk about the federal government a little bit more, and kudos, as you mentioned, to the Franklin Marshall College students who came up with some of these questions, which I thought were very good. I like the one that they talked about the different branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And the poll asked whether or not each branch, the legislative and the judicial, are doing their part as a co-branch of government along with the executive. And I thought the findings were very telling.
Yeah, that um, I think those findings are interesting, and but need to be read in context as well. Um, there was a whole series of questions, and our students are deeply interested in questions of democracy, and so we began that sequence of questions by asking how satisfied people are about American democracy and the way it's functioning. And there's a real partisan difference here. Uh, Republicans at the moment are more satisfied than dissatisfied. Democrats are more dissatisfied than satisfied. Now, we did ask that question in April of 2024, and it was the opposite. Democrats were satisfied, Republicans were. Imagine that, Steve. Um, so, there's a partisan element to this. And so then when we ask about the separation of powers, there is, because independents and Democrats tend to feel this way. I think 60% of the respondents said that the president, Congress has given up too much of its own powers. But I think about 55% said the courts have ceded too much power to the presidency. But there is a strong partisan difference here. And I know people ask all the time, why isn't Congress intervening? Why aren't the Republicans in Congress intervening? Well, if you look at the data, most Republicans do not believe Congress has ceded away its powers. Um, there's a partisan tinge to that. But the context, I think, that's essential when we're talking about satisfaction with democracy, or how we feel about separation of powers, is that we also asked a series of questions about commitment to democratic principles.
Right.
Things like free speech, things like the presumption of innocence and jury trials. I think there were 6 or 7 different questions that put forward those principles. And the good news is there isn't a partisan difference here. 90 some percent say, yes, jury by trial is essential. 90 some percent say, yes, free speech rights are essential. And that's consistent with what we've seen before. So some of these questions are going to have a partisan valence. But the heartening part for me, and the essential context for understanding these results, is that even though we may differ on exactly how we implement these things, we do share a fundamental agreement that these principles are essential parts of what we are as a country, and that gives me a little more hope than just focusing on the differences.
Was there anything, as all the information came in, you began to compile the results, was there anything that really surprised you when you tabulated everything?
Well, I think you hit on the a couple of them, right? The first was the fact that the economy was below kind of concerns about government. I
Mm.
should have expected that, but I didn't. And um, in part because some of the budget stuff's flying under the radar,
Right.
although we're 100 some days in. Maybe it was the add-on of the government shutdown at the federal level, but that was a bit of a surprise. Um, I think the improvement in Donald Trump's favorability ratings, particularly around things like immigration and foreign policy, and the decline around job creation, that was a bit of a shock to me. Of course, I found the AI questions were fascinating. The commitment to democratic principles I expected, and it was great to see that they held up. We've asked those questions before. Responses are consistent. But one thing we haven't talked about that I thought was
Mhm.
interesting, if not surprising, is we asked, how satisfied are you with what your party's been doing since the last election? We asked Republicans and Democrats that question. Republicans, 81% said, I'm satisfied with the direction my party has taken since last November. Do we want to bet on what the numbers were for Democrats? They were 23%.
Yeah.
And so, we've heard about, all the Democratic angst about the direction of the party. We've seen some of this play out during the government shutdown about, standing up and whatever. Um, the reality is the Democrats, not surprisingly, being the party out of power, are sort of searching for their identity. And so that showed up in the poll. I figured Republicans would be a bit happier than Democrats about the direction their party take. I didn't think it would be 60 points different, if I'm being honest with you.
You've always talked about how polls are a snapshot in time, that they don't have predictive powers. Yet a lot of attention is going to be placed on the Commonwealth when it comes to the 2026 midterms. You're going to look at presidential favorability and what does that mean going forward? Will the Republicans be able to retain the House? Will Democrats be able to get back a share? Is there anything that you think that you can glean from these numbers that may give us a hint? Like I said, I know how you feel about predictions.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, look, no, I mean, look, these are indicators along our path, right? They're waypoints. And I think I mentioned some of these things, right? The generic ballot sort of favors Democrats at the moment, but there's still a lot undecided. I think 15% of people say, I don't know how I'm going to vote in the congressional vote next year. But waypoints like gubernatorial job approval rating, presidential job approval rating, we know how strongly, particularly in a congressional race, the presidential approval ratings are for the party. That's going to affect the race, and so we got to keep a close eye on that. I think affecting how people judge the president's performance will be their assessments of their own personal finances. So, we'll keep an eye on all of those indicators that we've already talked about. Right now, I think there's a slight advantage for Democratic candidates at the congressional level if you look just contextually at all those indicators. But there's a long time to go and a lot could change, obviously. And so, it's anybody's guess what's going to happen. A lot of time between now and then. And by the way, I should mention, I don't think I mentioned, when we asked about the president's job performance on foreign policy, we were not in the field when the Israeli Hamas agreement was announced. So his numbers were good. I imagine they're even better now. And so, can that sort of approval on those areas help Republicans overall in the midterms? We'll see.
We've covered a lot of ground. I'll get you out here on this one. Was there any other number that we haven't touched on that you want to make sure that those listening dig deeper and find out more about?
Wow. There's so many numbers in this poll.
There are a lot of numbers.
Right? There's a lot of numbers here. I guess the one thing that's sort of interesting and reflects what we've seen in the voter registration rolls is how narrow the advantage is for Democrats now. When we sample, we try to make sure that our sample looks like the profile of registered voters in the state. Right now, Democrats and Republicans are close to tied in the registration figures. And if you've seen the registration numbers or if you followed our poll over the years, you could see the narrowing in that registration number. And that's consequential. There's two elements of that that are consequential. The gap between Republicans and Democrats have narrowed. So there's virtually no distance between them in terms of registration. And the number of independent or unaffiliated voters has doubled over the past 20 years. So right now you've got a pretty committed group of Republicans and Democrats supporting their candidate. And then you've got that group, ever-growing group of unaffiliated voters. And they're going to decide. They're going to decide the state Supreme Court race, and they're going to decide the 2020 election. And so at some point, and we include some of these numbers in the poll release, looking at where independents are, probably a good idea.
Will we be seeing another Franklin Marshall poll in the field come early 2026?
Yes, we will. It's hard to think that it'll soon be early 2026, but I think we're looking at doing the first poll of the midterm races probably sometime in February.
Always a pleasure to chat with our good friend Berwood Yost, the director of the Floyd Institute, the Center for Opinion Research at Franklin and Marshall College, for talking to us about the recently released Franklin and Marshall poll. Berwood, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's always fun, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Surprise.